So a little while ago I was asked by Jeff Nippard to take this Oxford Utilitarianism Scale test, which is going to tell me how utilitarian I am. And let's get on with it then. Let's do it. So, question number 1. If the only way to save another person's life during an emergency is to sacrifice one's own leg, then one is morally required to make this sacrifice. My initial question is, what is the emergency and how am I involved in this situation? I'd like to know more about this specific situation where I'm being asked to sacrifice my own leg in order to save another person. Kind of hard to imagine what might be going on there. Anyway, whatever the situation is, I would have to strongly disagree with that one. I don't really have much to say about this. I would say the notion that you might ever sort of owe your body to anybody else is pretty repugnant to me. I think that you can pretty much never be required to mutilate your own body. I mean, I don't know, maybe there are some very unusual circumstances where I might say that you would be morally required to do that. I don't accept any absolute inviolable principles, but I will say that the notion of bodily autonomy, bodily integrity is as close to a central principle as I have, and that's really the source of many of my other sort of views. I mean, that's why I strongly support drug legalization. I think it's your body, you should be able to put drugs inside it if you want to. That's why I'm extremely pro-choice about abortion. It's your body, you cannot be required to host another person inside it if you don't want to. That's why I support legalizing sex work. It's why I'm against infant circumcision and so on. People should be allowed to make their own decisions about their own bodies. To me, it's just sort of, it's like the most basic liberty. If you don't have control over your own body, then what do you have, Again, maybe there are some cases, some very extreme, unusual cases, because for me, any principle is always going to be more of a sort of rule of thumb than something that can absolutely never, under any circumstances, be violated. But still, as I say, bodily autonomy is a big one for me, so I'll strongly disagree. Right. It is morally right to harm an innocent person if harming them is a necessary means to helping several other innocent people. I mean, again, this is very vague. It's sort of annoyingly vague, really. I also would say, that this kind of question, I do wonder if in a test like this, this might be a sort of bad way of getting at what people's moral attitudes are, because people might think that they support a particular principle, but then any moral principle is probably going to face counterexamples that people might not have thought of. And indeed, one of the main projects of moral philosophy involves thinking about moral principles that seem plausible and then trying to develop cases where those principles lead to counterintuitive consequences. So, I don't know, just for example, take a principle like, if two adults consent to sex, then they should be allowed to do it. I think a lot of people would say, yes, that sounds right. We all want to see ourselves as being very liberal and very open about sex these days. But then many people who claim to endorse that kind of principle will probably object to cases like incest, for instance. Even though incest, it could be just two consenting adults. So I think people will often think that they endorse principles without really knowing what the consequences of those principles are. And if you were to spell out some of the consequences of those principles, people would end up qualifying their support. So with this second question, it's a very general sort of principle. And I would imagine that some people who endorse it might end up changing their minds when they're faced with particular specific cases. So anyway, what would I say about this? Well, I guess we could think of it in terms of the trolley problem. I mean, the trolley problem seems to be a useful way of thinking about this. I imagine most of you watching this video will be familiar with the trolley problem, but the standard trolley problem is where you have the trolley going down a track, and the track is headed towards 5 men who for some reason can't get off the track, and you have a lever which you could pull, and if you pull the lever, then the trolley will be diverted and it will go down a track where there's only 1 man. So it's basically like, you can pull a lever and kill 1 man to save 5, should you do it. Personally, I would say that in that kind of circumstance, I would pull the lever. So in that case, I would save I would harm an innocent person in order to save 5. On the other hand, there are plenty of circumstances where I wouldn't be willing to harm an innocent person in order to save 5. So again, in terms of the trolley problem, there was that other version of the trolley problem where it was the fat man, where the idea is that the trolley is headed down a track and it's going to kill 5 people, but you can prevent this from happening by pushing a fat man off a bridge in front of the trolley. I'm not really sure why. I mean, this man must be very, very large if this one fat man is going to stop the trolley that would otherwise kill 5 people. But whatever. It's a thought experiment. So in this case, would you push a person off a bridge and kill them that way in order to save 5? Well, no, I wouldn't do that. So for me, this one just depends on the situation, basically. So I suppose I would neither agree nor disagree. But I'd also add, I think another problem that I have with this question, it's not just that that I would do different things in different situations. I think that even framing the question as whether or not it's acceptable to harm an innocent person in order to save other innocent people, it sort of ignores or obscures other factors that I would say are morally relevant. There's a famous thought experiment developed by Bernard Williams in his critique of utilitarianism, the Jim and Pedro case. And I think this is a useful example for highlighting some of the ways in which utilitarian thinking obscures factors that I would consider to be morally interesting, morally relevant. So if you've never heard of the Jim and Pedro case, I can't remember the exact details of it now actually, but the basic idea is that Jim is trekking around some foreign country, say he's trekking around the Amazon or something, and let's say there's a civil war going on. Anyway, he comes upon a clearing where there are where a bunch of militants have invaded a village, and the captain of the militants, Pedro, has got 20 completely innocent villagers, and he's about to kill them all. But then Pedro sees Jim, and he says, "Oh, look, a foreigner, that makes this a special occasion. So since this is a special occasion, I will allow you, Jim, to take my gun and kill one of these tribes people. If you do that, I'll let the rest of them go. Or you can not kill any of them, in which case I'll just kill all of them." So in this Jim and Pedro case, Jim faces this choice that he's given by Pedro. Pedro offers him the choice of kill one tribesperson and I'll let the rest of them go, or I'll just kill all of them. So, I mean, the utilitarian answer to that is very obvious. It's like, of course, Jim should kill the one so that the others can go free, and that's actually probably the decision that I would make as well. I think that's probably what I would do. But the point is that in this kind of case, what's interesting about this is that Pedro is another agent, and so Jim doesn't really have the power to prevent the deaths of the other tribespeople. So if Jim takes this option of shooting one, he doesn't really have the power to prevent the deaths of the others in doing this. So in standard trolley problem cases, we need to think about, say, the distinction between what you do and what you allow to happen. when you face the track with the trolley going down it towards 5 men and you can pull the lever to redirect it towards 1, you've got this question of, well, do you allow the 5 men to die, or do you switch and kill 1 man? Either way, whatever happens is entirely in your hands now. It's entirely up to you. You can kill 1 man to prevent the deaths of the 5 men, or you can let the 5 men die, right? But it's up to you. On the other hand, in the Jim and Pedro case, there's another agent. There's Pedro. So if Jim says, no, I'm not going to kill the 1 tribesperson, it's not that the others are just going to die, right? They're going to be killed by this other agent, Pedro. But of course, Jim has no real control over Pedro. Only Pedro can decide whether he will kill the tribespeople. So if Jim takes up Pedro's offer and kills this one tribesperson, that can in no way compel Pedro to let the others go. Similarly, if Jim refuses Pedro's offer and says he's going to refuse to kill the 1 tribesperson, that in no way compels Pedro to kill all of them. The point that is made by this example is that we have a kind of special responsibility for our own actions. And so when you put other agents into the picture, that complicates things. So we might say that, well, yeah, if Jim chooses to kill the 1 tribesperson, he's helping the others. But that's not quite the same as what's going on in the case where if Jim switches the tracks, he's helping the other 5 men. If Jim switches the tracks, this compels, as it were, the trolley to avoid the 5 men. But for Jim, he can't compel Pedro to do anything. It's up to Pedro whether or not he kills all the tribespeople. So one problem with utilitarianism, and actually one problem with sort of framing moral issues in this kind of way that this question does, is it sort of removes other agents from the picture. That's one point. There's another point that I guess is connected to this, which is I suppose it's this notion of morally right. So it says here, it is morally right to harm an innocent person if harming them is a necessary means to helping several other innocent people. So many moral theories, and utilitarianism is one of them, like this. The goal is to provide a guide to action. So if a particular option is what you should do, then it's the morally right option. And certainly in the case of Jim and Pedro, for a utilitarian, there's just no question about what you should do. Of course, Jim should kill 1 to save the others. I suppose a deontological ethical theory might issue a similarly clear answer, but the other way around. It might say that no, absolutely, Jim should not kill the other person. He's not responsible for what Pedro does. Either way, there's a sort of clear answer about what you should do in that situation, and then what you should do is just the morally right thing. And yet this, to me, sort of kind of misses the point that sometimes there are just bad choices, and there might not be any morally right option one way or the other. Of course, you still have to face a choice. My sort of thinking is that in the case of the Jim and Pedro example and in the trolley example, it's sort of completely impersonal. I don't know any of these people. You might as well save the maximum number. That's kind of the way I think about it. But I don't think I would condemn somebody who makes a different choice. So I wouldn't. I personally, if I were in Jim's shoes, I would kill the 1 tribesperson, but I wouldn't blame somebody who chooses differently. I think the responsibility for the killings would lie entirely with Pedro. Similarly, in the trolley problem, I would switch. I wouldn't blame somebody who wouldn't switch. So I do wonder if this, for me, is even a moral position at all. Because it seems like for me it's more a matter of just personal taste, because I'm not going to condemn people, I'm not going to blame people for taking a different option. My sort of attitude is just, there are situations where there isn't anything good that you can do. There are situations that are genuine moral dilemmas, that situations where you will quite correctly feel guilt and regret no matter which way you go with it. So anyway, what do I say about this? I suppose I'm going to disagree with it then. Maybe somewhat disagree, be more my attitude. Okay, from a moral point of view, we should feel obliged to give one of our kidneys to a person with kidney failure, since we don't need 2 kidneys to survive, but really only one to be healthy. So as I said before, I think you don't owe your body to anybody else. Quite honestly, I doubt I'd give up one of my kidneys even to somebody that I really love, Never mind to just a random person with kidney failure. But who knows how I might act in that situation if it was somebody I cared about. But still, I certainly wouldn't make it any kind of moral requirement. It's a nice thing to do, but I don't think you're morally required. Right. If the only way to ensure the overall well-being and happiness of the people is through the use of political oppression for a short limited period, then political oppression should be used. I don't know. Again, this is quite vague, and to be honest, I haven't thought much about this sort of issue. So in terms of its being vague, I mean, what is the threat that these people are facing? What kind of political oppression are we talking about here? I can understand why in times of war or massive social catastrophe or whatever, you might suspend elections or something, or you might require incursions on individual liberties. I can understand that. Having said that, I haven't really thought about this issue to any extent, really, so I suppose there's not really much I can say about it. I mean, I lean towards agreeing that this might sometimes be necessary, but that's really all I can say on that one. Just haven't thought about the issue that much. Right. From a moral perspective, people should care about the well-being of all humans on the planet equally. They should not favour the well-being of people who are especially close to them, either physically or emotionally. I personally think that this view is just outright evil. I couldn't disagree more with this, and this is one of the many things that bothers me about utilitarianism. Anyway, I would say that there are lots of people that just don't deserve your care because they're bad people or just worthless people. Nobody's entitled to your care or love or respect or whatever. Those things are things that people earned, and there are lots of really unpleasant people in the world. I don't know why you would care about their well-being as much as you would care about the well-being of good people. And even the good people, I mean, there are plenty of good people in the world that you don't know, so you shouldn't care so much about them. You should care about the people that you know and love. To love somebody just is to value them more. I mean, what would love even be? What's that going to be if it doesn't involve giving somebody preferential treatment? If it doesn't involve valuing them more and trying to promote their well-being over the well-being of others? I'm just not sure what love is going to involve in terms of your behaviour and your interaction with them, if not that. Now, of course, utilitarians can allow people to have greater care and concern for their close family and friends if this kind of psychology and this kind of behaviour would tend to maximise happiness. After all, there are very few people in the world who want to be islands, right? We want to have close relationships. And you might say that part of having a close relationship is, it involves giving preferential treatment to that person, doing more for that person. So the utilitarian would not necessarily agree with this. I think a utilitarian could indeed say that actually you should care about the well-being of your loved ones, more than you care about the well-being of strangers. Because in a world in which you didn't do that, if you didn't have people that you cared about, then you just might not ever have close relationships, and that's an important part of happiness, right? So it would actually maximize happiness to encourage people to form close relationships. I would just say that that's a very strange way of thinking, at least to me. That's a strange way of thinking about relationships, because it ends up meaning that my love for my girlfriend, say, becomes conditional on the empirical claim that loving somebody and having a close relationship and caring about them more than I care about others and so on, that becomes conditional on the empirical claim that this is in fact the best way to maximize happiness. But certainly that's not how I think. I think that's a very bizarre way of thinking. I mean, the point is that, that the love is basic. It's not. It doesn't have any further reason, right? It's not. I suppose, maybe there is no such thing as completely unconditional love, but it's certainly, your love is not going to be conditional on an empirical claim about how having close relationships is the best way of maximizing happiness. So I would tend to say that for a utilitarian, even if a utilitarian would not necessarily agree with this, there's still going to be a problem, because for the utilitarian, they're still going to be weighing the consequences and making a calculation and trying to figure out if having a close relationship is in fact the right way of maximizing the utility. I think at this point it's probably also worth mentioning my meta-ethics. I'm not a moral realist. I'm very firmly on the anti-realist side. I would say that morality is something that arises out of our emotions. Morality is based on emotional dispositions. And so if utilitarianism requires us to care about the well-being of all humans equally, or if it says that you can have greater care for those close to you, provided this maximizes happiness or whatever, I would say that it is, in a sense, false, in the sense that it fails to capture what our actual moral attitudes are. Nobody is really a utilitarian. I suppose that you could treat it as an ideal, right? So you could say, well, all right, perhaps nobody is actually a utilitarian, in the sense that nobody has the moral responses, the emotional responses that would make them utilitarian, a genuine, true utilitarian. But of course, people can want to have different emotional reactions to those that they actually have. Somebody who is very prone to anger, say, might consider their anger unreasonable and want to temper it, and they can then work to temper it. So in the same way, even if it's the case that nobody is really a utilitarian, that because their emotional reactions just don't work out that way, they can, of course, desire to have different emotional reactions. But then there's a question about why. Utilitarianism is a very simple theory, which is, at least at its heart, obviously utilitarians of different forms have qualified it in various ways and introduced different ways of understanding it. But the basic idea of utilitarianism is a very straightforward one. It becomes an empirical question, I suppose. What maximizes happiness, or what maximizes whatever it is that utilitarians want to maximize? It becomes an empirical question: which course of action is going to achieve that? So that's a nice feature of a moral theory. But on the other hand, emotions are very messy and complex, and we live in a very messy world. Why would you try to reduce your moral theory in this kind of way? We're not, after all, creating a scientific theory here. We're not shouldn't be trying to describe facts in the world. And so then it's hard to see the motivation for bulldozing over the important features of human experience and human relationships. Right. It is permissible to torture an innocent person if this would be necessary to provide information to prevent a bomb going off that would kill hundreds of people. It's kind of hard to imagine a situation in which an innocent person isn't revealing that information by choice. I mean, if you know where a bomb is located and you're not giving up the information, if you know where a bomb is located and you're not giving up that information, would you be innocent there? I want to again know a bit more about this scenario. Anyway, is torture ever permissible? I think it's very worthwhile having a law against torture. Torture is generally, ineffective, right? Even if you forget about the moral question, it's very often impractical because it just doesn't work. People will say anything to make you stop. But yes, certainly morally questionable too. But I can imagine situations where I'd be willing to break the law in that case, and maybe preventing a bomb going off if there's hundreds of lives at stake. Yeah, I personally would probably be willing to torture somebody to get that information out of them. And especially if it's like the lives that are at stake include those of people I love. If the bomb is somewhere in a city where, my girlfriend is, then I would absolutely be willing to torture somebody to get them to tell me the information. So let's have a law against torture, by all means, but I would be willing sometimes to break that law. So I guess I would have to agree that, maybe it can be permissible in very unusual situations. But, maybe sometimes. Maybe that should be more a somewhat agree. I really generally don't like torture. So somewhat agree, let's say. It is just as wrong to fail to help someone as it is to actively harm them yourself. I guess I've already spoken about this in speaking about the other questions. I think we've sort of already covered this. In my view, there can be differences in this kind of case, and I'm not going to just accept this as just a general principle. So disagree. Sometimes it is morally necessary for innocent people to die as collateral damage if more is saved overall. Again, I think I've pretty much already talked about this. I think we've kind of had this question. I personally would tend, in many circumstances, to sacrifice some innocent lives to save a larger number, especially if I don't have any personal connection to the people in question. So in the kind of trolley case, in the Jim and Pedro case, I would probably sacrifice the innocent life to save a greater number. But in other cases, I'd probably act differently, and in any way, I don't think it's morally necessary to do any of these things. I think that somebody who makes a different choice, I probably wouldn't blame them for that. So yeah, we'll disagree. It is morally wrong to keep money that one doesn't really need if one can donate it to causes that provide effective help to those who will benefit a great deal. So how much, I guess the general question that's coming up here is, how much are you required to sacrifice to help others? Actually, I would say you're required to sacrifice very, very, very little. Maybe to take a slightly different situation that utilitarians often use, this is one of Peter Singer's favourite thought experiments, is to imagine that you're walking to work or whatever, and you see a child drowning in a pond, and it's perfectly safe for you to jump in and save the child. So there's a child drowning in a pond, you could easily save them, but if you do that, you're going to ruin your new shoes. So, should you jump in and save the drowning child? Well, I mean, actually, there's, of course, the distinction between the legal and moral requirements. I mean, legally, I would say that actually you should have absolutely no responsibility to do that. I don't think that you should be legally required to save the child. I used to be a libertarian. I used to be a very hardcore libertarian when I was like a teenager. Many years ago, I changed my mind about that. I'm not a... When I say libertarian, by the way, I should just specify, I mean I was like a US-style libertarian. So the kind that you get in the US Libertarian Party. Actually, I was sometimes even inclined to be an anarcho-capitalist, along the lines of someone like Murray Rothbard. I was very extreme for a long time, but I changed my mind, again, quite a long time ago. That was just when I was a teenager. I guess the reason why I moderated my attitude was I just sort of thought, at least when I wasn't in my anarcho-capitalist phase, I kind of came to think that, yes, things like taxes and so on are necessary for military and the courts and the police. Like, you need the state to do that sort of stuff. But then it's sort of a short step. I mean, once you've granted that you have to allow the state to run the police and the military, I mean, it just seemed to me to be a short step to allowing it to be involved in other public goods like the health service and education and benefits for people who needed it, and so on. I moved away from a hardcore libertarian position. However, I still really believe in the idea of having a society where people are free to pursue their own lifestyles, their own views, to make their own decisions about their lives without interference from others. And so a big part of that for me is no legal requirement that you help others in need. I mean, there's a requirement that you support the state, and then the state can then distribute money charitably, in as it were, per the interests of the population, right? That's through having a democracy. The democracy decides how the state distributes the tax money. But you as an individual, in your personal life, should not be legally required to help any other specific other individual. That's my general attitude there. So I think legally, there should be no requirement that you help the drowning child. That's legally. Morally, I am inclined to say that you should save the child. But the reason why I bring this up is this example has been used in an interesting way by utilitarians like Peter Singer. Singer uses this example to argue that you are also required to give up your money to charity. And the point there is that, the shoes, I don't know how much the shoes cost, but they're new shoes. You spent a certain amount of money on the shoes. Saving the child, you are losing money. But we think that you have a moral responsibility to intervene and save that child's life. I'm obligated to save the child even though I'd ruin my shoes. But then similarly, you could save a child in another country by making a sacrifice of a similar degree. I mean, it's like, let's say you're out and you think to yourself, let's say you've got lots of shoes and you decide you're going to go and buy another pair of shoes. Well, you now face a decision. That money that you intend to pay for the shoes, you could instead not get the shoes and just send it to charity. And you might, if that money goes to things like malaria nets and so on, you could save many children with this money. And so the attitude of many utilitarians like Peter Singer is, if you're obligated to save the drowning child, and of course you are obligated to save the drowning child, you're also obligated to give your money to charity rather than use it on luxury items. Now, that's the general utilitarian argument. I think there are many ways of avoiding that conclusion. What I would say is that actually geography matters, personal relations matter, and although you may not know this drowning child very well, simply by seeing the child, simply by coming across that child, there is suddenly a personal connection because you're actually there with them. It's a weak personal connection, but it's there nonetheless. And of course the sacrifice is very minor and so on. But let's assume that we do face a dilemma. Let's assume, for the sake of argument, either it's obligatory to give up money to charity, or it's permissible to let the child drown. I think that in response to that dilemma, I would just say, in that case, it's morally permissible to let the child drown. So I just use this as an example of how I make very, very limited moral demands on others. So I would not require morally, and certainly not legally, anybody to donate their money to charity. So, strongly disagree with that one, and that's all of them. So now we're going to find out how utilitarian I am. I imagine I'm not very utilitarian, but let's see what the test says. And results, I am 21 out of 63 utilitarian. That's my degree of utilitarianism. I'm not going to read through all of this, but I mean, let's just look a little bit at what it says. You know, according to classical utilitarianism, we should always act in a way that would maximise aggregate well-being. I mean, I think it's pretty obvious that that's not how I think people should act. What's this? Impartial beneficence. Sorry, I'm quite tired today. Anyway, the philosophical core of utilitarianism lies in the impartial maximisation of the greater good. That's pretty repugnant to me. So yes, I'm not very utilitarian. Not a huge surprise, that result. Anyway, that's all. Thank you very much, Jeff Nippard, for the suggestion that I take this test. If anybody has any other suggestions for videos they want me to do, let me know. That's all for now.